It was a moonless night, and I was on a long, desolate stretch of highway that cut through the dense woods of the American Southwest. I had been driving for hours, trying to make good time on my journey to visit family in Arizona. The clock on my dashboard read 2:37 a.m., and exhaustion was starting to set in. I couldn't wait to reach my destination and crawl into a warm bed. The road was deserted, and the only company I had was the hum of the engine and the faint glow of my headlights slicing through the darkness. Tall pine trees loomed on either side of the road, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. It was the kind of remote, desolate highway that you only find in the middle of nowhere. As I continued driving, my fatigue began to weigh on me, and I decided to pull over at the next available rest area to catch a quick nap. Just as I was about to lose hope of finding one, I saw a weathered sign that pointed to a rest area up ahead. Relieved, I turned off the highway and onto a narrow, winding road that led deeper into the woods. The rest area was nestled among the trees, and a small, flickering sign announced its presence. It seemed like the perfect spot to take a break and recharge for the remaining hours of the journey. But as soon as I parked my car and switched off the engine, a sense of unease washed over me. The woods were eerily quiet, devoid of the usual nighttime sounds. There were no chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, just a heavy silence that hung in the air like a suffocating blanket. I chalked it up to the isolation of the rest area and tried to push the feeling aside. I reclined my seat and closed my eyes, intending to take a quick power nap. But before sleep could claim me, I heard a strange sound. It was a faint, high-pitched wail, like a mournful cry, coming from somewhere deep in the woods. My eyes snapped open, and my heart began to race. The cry echoed through the trees, and it was unlike anything I had ever heard before. It sounded both human and animal, a twisted combination of pain and desperation. Panic welled up inside me, and I sat up, straining my ears to locate the source of the sound. That's when I saw it, or rather, what I thought was a person stumbling out of the woods. A dark figure, hunched and disheveled, emerged from the trees and began limping toward the rest area. My first instinct was to help, to offer assistance to someone who seemed to be in distress. I got out of my car and called out, "Hey, are you okay?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it continued to move toward me with slow, shuffling steps. It was hard to make out any details in the dim light, but something about its appearance sent a shiver down my spine. As it drew closer, I noticed that its movements were unnatural, jerky, and disjointed, like a marionette being controlled by unseen hands. And then, its eyes reflected the faint light from my car's interior, revealing a sickly yellow glow. A feeling of dread washed over me as I realized that I was not looking at a person. I was face to face with a creature that defied explanation. It was tall, with long, gnarled limbs, and its face was a grotesque mask of twisted features. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth, and it emitted that same mournful wail, only now it was much louder and more sinister. Fear paralyzed me as I stood there, unable to move, unable to tear my eyes away from the abomination before me. The creature's yellow eyes bore into mine, and I felt an overwhelming sense of malevolence radiating from it. It was a skinwalker, a being of Native American legend, and I was trapped in its gaze. With a sudden burst of unnatural speed, the skinwalker lunged at me, its elongated limbs reaching out like a nightmare. Panic finally broke the hold on my body, and I stumbled backward, barely managing to get back into my car and slam the door shut just in time. The creature collided with the side of my car, its long fingers clawing at the windows with a terrible screeching sound. I fumbled for my keys and started the engine, my heart pounding in my chest. The skinwalker continued to assault my car, but with a sickening thud, it was left behind in the darkness as I sped away. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I parked in a well-lit area and tried to catch my breath. I knew what I had seen couldn't be explained by rational means. It was a skinwalker, a supernatural entity that had crossed my path in the dead of night. To this day, I can't shake the feeling of dread that washed over me during that encounter. I'll never know what the skinwalker wanted or why it had chosen to reveal itself to. I've always been drawn to the serene beauty of snow-covered landscapes, so when my friend suggested a winter vacation in a remote cabin in the Colorado Rockies, I couldn't resist. Little did I know that our picturesque getaway would turn into a chilling encounter with the paranormal, forever etching the memory of that fateful trip into my mind. The cabin was nestled deep within the mountains, accessible only by a winding, snow-covered road that seemed to stretch endlessly into the wilderness. It was a cozy, rustic retreat with a breathtaking view of the surrounding peaks. The first few days were pure bliss, warm fires, hot cocoa, and endless games by the fireplace. But as the week wore on, the idyllic setting began to feel eerily isolated. Our cell phones lost signal, and the cabin's landline remained dead. We had intentionally chosen this remote location to disconnect from the world, but now the isolation was becoming unnerving. One evening, as the snowstorm raged outside, we gathered around the cabin's dining table, sharing ghost stories to pass the time. Little did we know that our own story was about to unfold. On the third night, as we played cards, a strange noise echoed from outside the cabin. It was a high-pitched, almost keening sound, like the cry of an injured animal. We exchanged puzzled glances, but dismissed it as the wind howling through the trees. Later that night, I was jolted awake by the same eerie sound. I listened intently, straining to identify its source. It seemed to be coming from just beyond the cabin's walls. My curiosity got the best of me, and I wrapped myself in a thick coat, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped outside. The freezing night air hit me like a wave, but I pushed on, following the sound of the eerie cries. My flashlight beam danced through the snow-covered trees, and that's when I saw it, a shadowy figure moving among the pines. My heart raced as I approached cautiously, the beam of my flashlight revealing a tall, thin silhouette cloaked in tattered rags. I couldn't see its face, but the way it moved was wrong, like a marionette with strings pulled askew. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the figure wasn't alone. It seemed to be conversing with someone or something I couldn't see. I hid behind a tree, trembling with fear as I watched in horror. The figure's movements became more erratic, and the conversation turned into a guttural, inhuman exchange of sounds that sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't understand a word of it, but I knew it was something far from ordinary. As if sensing my presence, the figure turned its head in my direction, and the flashlight beam caught its eyes. They glowed with a malevolent, yellowish light, like two orbs of burning embers. I gasped, and the figure's gaze locked onto mine. I wanted to run, to scream, but my legs felt like lead, and my voice refused to cooperate. The figure slowly approached, its limbs contorting in a nightmarish dance as it moved closer and closer, its eyes never leaving mine. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like I was staring into the abyss of something ancient and malevolent. Panic coursed through me as I finally broke free from my paralysis and stumbled backward. I fled back into the cabin, locking the door behind me. My friends were already awake, their faces etched with concern as they saw the terror in my eyes. I tried to explain what I had seen, but the words stumbled out incoherently. We decided to hunker down for the night, our unease hanging over us like a heavy shroud. As the hours passed, the cries from outside continued, haunting our every moment. We had no phone, no way to call for help, and nowhere to run. Morning finally came, and we ventured outside to find no trace of the figure. The snow-covered landscape was pristine, and the forest was eerily quiet. It was as if the night's events had never occurred. We packed up our things and left the cabin, determined to put as much distance between us and that chilling encounter as possible. The memory of that snowy mountain night still haunts me. I can't explain what I saw or the unnatural fear it instilled in me. It was a true encounter with the unknown, a brush with the paranormal that defies rational explanation. All I know is that in those remote, snow-covered mountains, something beyond the realm of our understanding lurked, waiting for a chance to reveal itself. I've never been one to easily believe in the paranormal, but an experience I had while hitchhiking through the desolate highways of New Mexico changed everything. This is my true, first-person account of encountering a skinwalker while trying to catch a ride. It was a hot and dusty afternoon when I found myself stranded on a desolate stretch of Route 66. The sun bore down on me relentlessly, and the only shade was cast by the scrubby bushes that dotted the barren landscape. I had been hitchhiking for hours, trying to make my way to the next town, when a beat-up pickup truck pulled over to the side of the road. Relief washed over me as I approached the truck, my backpack heavy on my shoulders. The driver, a weathered man in his 50s with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes, leaned over and pushed open the passenger door. Without a word, I climbed in, grateful for the ride. The interior of the truck was cluttered with empty coffee cups and fast food wrappers. The air conditioner wheezed, struggling to combat the sweltering heat. The driver glanced at me briefly before fixing his gaze back on the road. His eyes were dark and unremarkable, but something about his demeanor sent a shiver down my spine. As we drove, a strange tension filled the cab. The driver remained silent, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. I tried to strike up a conversation, asking him about the weather and the road ahead, but he only grunted in response. It was as if he wanted nothing more than to keep his focus on the road. We drove in silence for miles, passing through a seemingly endless expanse of desert. The barren landscape stretched on, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the driver. His stoic demeanor was unsettling, and his eyes seemed to hide a dark secret. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the road, the driver finally spoke. His voice was low and raspy, sending a shiver down my spine. "You ever heard of skinwalkers?" he asked, his eyes never leaving the road. I knew the term from Native American folklore, but I had never expected to hear it in the context of a conversation with a stranger. Skinwalkers were said to be shapeshifters, able to take on the form of animals or other people, and they were often associated with malevolent intentions. I nodded cautiously, unsure of where this conversation was headed. "Yeah, I've heard of them." The driver continued, his voice now tinged with a sense of urgency. "You gotta be careful out here, especially when you're hitchhiking. Skinwalkers are real, and they like to prey on travelers like you and me." My heart began to race as I realized the gravity of what he was saying. I had always dismissed such stories as superstition, but the unease in the driver's voice made me reconsider. He went on to recount chilling tales of skinwalker encounters in the region, stories of hitchhikers disappearing without a trace, their fate sealed by these malevolent beings. His words painted a horrifying picture of the dangers that lurked in the vast, unforgiving desert. I glanced out the window, my imagination running wild with images of shape-shifting creatures stalking us from the shadows. The desolation of the landscape suddenly felt suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As the night grew darker, the driver's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would alternate between staring at the road with a fierce intensity and glancing at me with a sinister grin. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I knew I had to get out of that truck. I feigned a need to use the restroom, hoping to create an excuse to escape. The driver reluctantly pulled over at a desolate rest area, and I quickly grabbed my backpack and made a dash for the restroom building. Inside, I locked myself in a stall, my heart pounding. Moments later, I heard the driver's heavy boots approach the restroom. His footsteps stopped just outside my stall, and I held my breath, fearing the worst. But then, I heard a strange sound, like bones cracking and joints popping. It was a sickening sound, one that sent a shiver of dread through me. Peering through a crack in the stall door, I saw something that will haunt my nightmares for the rest of my life. The driver's form seemed to blur and contort. His limbs elongated, and his face twisted into a grotesque mask. In the dim light, I could see his eyes glowing with an otherworldly malevolence. The creature that stood before me was no longer the man who had picked me up. It was a skinwalker, and it had revealed its true form. My heart raced, and I knew I had to escape before it could harm me. I burst out of the stall and ran out of the restroom, leaving my backpack behind. I sprinted into the darkness, my breath ragged and my heart pounding. I didn't look back, and I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of a nearby gas station. Living alone in the countryside had always been my dream. I had grown tired of the city's noise and stress, and I yearned for a simpler life, surrounded by nature. So, when I stumbled upon a charming old farmhouse nestled in the heart of a remote countryside, I knew I had found my paradise. Little did I know that my peaceful retreat would soon become the setting for a paranormal encounter that would change my life forever. The farmhouse sat at the end of a long, winding dirt road, surrounded by endless fields and forests. It was a picture-perfect place, complete with a white picket fence and a wraparound porch that seemed to beckon me home. I moved in during the late spring, excited about the solitude and the opportunity to live off the land. The first few weeks were idyllic. I spent my days tending to the garden, exploring the woods, and reveling in the tranquility that surrounded me. My only neighbors were miles away, and I cherished the silence of the countryside. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the fields, I was sitting on my porch, sipping a cup of tea. The day's work had left me tired but content. I watched the fireflies dance in the fading light, feeling a profound sense of peace wash over me. Then, I heard it, a soft, melodic singing that seemed to come from deep within the forest. It was unlike anything I had ever heard before, ethereal and haunting. I strained my ears to listen, trying to make out the words, but it was in a language I couldn't understand. As the singing continued, I noticed a figure emerging from the woods. It was a woman, or at least it appeared to be one. She moved gracefully, her long, flowing hair glinting in the dying light. Her dress was tattered and old-fashioned, as if from another era. I couldn't see her face clearly, but her presence sent shivers down my spine. I called out to her, asking if she needed help or if she was lost, but she didn't acknowledge me. She continued to sing, her voice growing more captivating and hypnotic with each passing moment. It was as if she were drawing me in, luring me deeper into the forest. I stood up, my curiosity getting the better of me, and began to follow her. The forest seemed to come alive around me, with the trees swaying in time to her song and the fireflies forming a glowing trail that led the way. I followed her for what felt like hours, the boundaries between reality and dream blurring. The forest grew denser, and the singing became more enchanting, but I couldn't see the woman clearly. It was as if she were always just out of reach. Suddenly, the singing stopped, and I found myself standing in a small clearing deep in the woods. The woman was gone, and I was alone. Panic set in as I realized I had no idea where I was or how to get back home. I turned to retrace my steps, but the forest had changed. The once familiar path was now a labyrinth of twisted trees and shadowy figures. The air grew cold, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant whispering of the wind. I stumbled through the dark woods, disoriented and terrified, desperately searching for any sign of civilization. Hours turned into days, and I began to lose hope. Hunger and exhaustion gnawed at me, and I feared I would never find my way back. Then, on the third day, I heard it again, the haunting melody of the woman's song. It was faint but unmistakable, and it gave me a glimmer of hope. I followed the sound, determined to find her and, hopefully, a way back home. As I moved deeper into the forest, the singing grew louder, and I began to see flashes of movement among the trees. The figures were indistinct, like shadows, and they seemed to be watching me, whispering to one another in that strange, incomprehensible language. I finally reached a clearing, and there she was, the woman in the tattered dress, her hair flowing in the wind, her voice filling the air. But this time, I could see her face, and what I saw sent a shock of terror through me. Her eyes were empty, soulless, and her mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. She beckoned to me with a bony, outstretched hand, and I knew I had to run. I turned and sprinted in the opposite direction, fueled by fear and adrenaline. I ran for what felt like an eternity, the forest around me becoming a nightmarish maze of shifting shadows and malevolent whispers. I was certain I was lost forever, destined to wander the cursed woods until the end of my days. But then, just when I thought I couldn't go on, I burst through the tree line and found myself back at the edge of my own property. The farmhouse stood before me, bathed in the warm light of the setting sun. It was as if the forest had released its grip on me, returning me to the safety of my home. I stumbled inside, exhausted and traumatized, vowing never to venture into those woods again. I couldn't explain what had happened to me, but I knew that I had encountered something unnatural. The wind whispered through the towering pine trees as I trekked deeper into the dense, shadowy forest of the Pacific Northwest. My friends and I were on a backpacking adventure, seeking solitude and natural beauty far from the hustle and bustle of city life. Little did we know that the forest held secrets darker than we could ever imagine. Our first 2 days were idyllic, with clear skies and chirping birds guiding our way. We set up camp near a serene, crystal-clear lake nestled among the trees. As evening approached on the 3rd day, an uneasiness began to settle in. The once familiar sounds of the forest took on an eerie, unsettling quality, and the temperature dropped noticeably. We huddled around our campfire, trying to dispel the growing sense of foreboding. The flames cast dancing shadows on the trees, and the night was filled with an unnatural silence. We laughed nervously, dismissing our unease as simple paranoia. As the hours passed, my friend Sarah spotted something moving on the edge of the tree line. It was dark, shapeless, and barely discernible in the darkness. We all strained our eyes to get a better look, but it vanished into the underbrush before we could make out any details. "That was probably just a deer or some other animal," Mark said, trying to sound confident. But we all knew that whatever we had seen wasn't any ordinary forest creature. We decided to turn in for the night, promising ourselves that we were just being spooked by the unfamiliar surroundings. However, sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing rustling sounds in the distance and imagined that I saw fleeting shadows moving among the trees whenever I opened my eyes. Sometime in the middle of the night, I awoke to an oppressive silence. The fire had dwindled to a few glowing embers, casting an eerie red hue over our campsite. My friends were still asleep in their tents, but something compelled me to unzip mine and step outside. The moment I emerged from the tent, I felt an icy chill in the air, and the forest around me seemed different, transformed. The once familiar trees now looked like towering, twisted sentinels, and the stars overhead twinkled with malevolence. I heard the rustling again, this time closer, more deliberate. My heart pounded as I scanned the darkness. And then, I saw it. A shadowy figure emerged from behind a tree, its outline shifting and contorting. It looked like a person, but it wasn't. Its limbs elongated and twisted in grotesque ways, and its eyes glowed with a malevolent, amber light. My breath caught in my throat as I realized I was face to face with something otherworldly. I tried to move, to scream, but my body refused to obey. The figure stepped closer, its gaze never leaving mine. In that moment, I understood that this was a skinwalker, a creature from Native American legends with the power to take on the appearance of animals or humans. The thing that terrified me the most was that it was mimicking me, copying my every move. Every step I took backward, it mirrored, until it was inches from me, its contorted face twisted into a mockery of my own. A guttural growl emerged from its throat, sending shivers down my spine. It wasn't just imitating me, it was trying to become me. Panic surged through me, and I finally found my voice, letting out a scream that pierced the night. My friends burst from their tents, flashlights in hand, and the skinwalker fled into the forest, vanishing as if it had never been there. I was left trembling and gasping for air, my friends trying to console me, not fully comprehending the terror I had just experienced. We abandoned our campsite and fled deeper into the forest, leaving behind the haunting presence that had invaded our peaceful wilderness escape. The suspense of that night haunted me long after we returned home, a chilling reminder that there are forces in this world. My name is Alex, and I was spending the summer with my parents and younger sister, Emily, at our family cabin deep in the heart of the Navajo Nation. We had always been drawn to the natural beauty of the area, but we were well aware of the legends that surrounded it. The most unsettling of these legends was that of the Skinwalker, a creature said to possess the ability to transform into any animal it wished. On that fateful night, as I stepped onto the porch, I heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. It was just a harmless animal, I thought to myself, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. But then I heard it again, this time closer. I strained my eyes in the darkness, trying to make out any movement. "Alex, what are you doing out there?" my mother's voice called from inside the cabin. "Just checking something, Mom," I replied, not wanting to alarm her. I tiptoed toward the edge of the porch, trying to peer into the blackness of the forest. And then I saw it, a pair of eyes glowing like embers in the moonlight. They were low to the ground, just above the bushes. Panic seized me as I realized those eyes belonged to something no ordinary animal. It was too big to be a coyote, and too unnatural to be a wolf. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Whatever it was watching me, and the thought sent chills down my spine. I hurried back into the cabin and locked the door behind me. "What's wrong, Alex?" my father asked, concern etched on his face. "I saw something out there," I stammered, my voice trembling. "Something in the bushes. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't right." My parents exchanged worried glances, and Emily clung to my mother's leg, her wide eyes reflecting her fear. "We've heard the stories," my father said in a hushed voice. "It could be a skinwalker." My stomach turned as the word hung in the air. We all knew the legends, and we knew the danger they posed. Skinwalkers were said to be witches who had turned to dark magic, gaining the ability to shapeshift into animals and wreak havoc on those they targeted. We decided to stay inside and lock all the doors and windows. My father, ever the pragmatic one, assured us that it was probably just a wild animal and that it would eventually move on. But deep down, I knew it was something more. The night wore on, and the tension in the cabin was palpable. We huddled together in the living room, the only source of light coming from the flickering flames of the fireplace. The wind howled outside, adding to our unease. Suddenly, we heard a scratching sound coming from the front door. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like claws on wood. My heart raced as we all turned toward the door, fear in our eyes. "Stay here," my father whispered, grabbing a heavy poker from the fireplace. He cautiously approached the door, his eyes fixed on the knob. And then, it happened, the door handle began to turn slowly, as if someone, or something, was trying to enter. My father's grip on the poker tightened, and he pushed against the door with all his strength, keeping the intruder at bay. "Go away," my father shouted, his voice filled with a mix of fear and anger. "You're not welcome here." The door rattled violently as whatever was on the other side struggled to get in. The rest of us huddled together, paralyzed with fear. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the scratching and rattling stopped. It was as if the intruder had vanished into thin air. We spent the rest of the night huddled together in the living room, listening to the eerie sounds of the forest outside. The first rays of dawn finally broke through the windows, and we dared to venture outside. There were no signs of the intruder, no footprints in the dirt, nothing to prove that it had ever been there. As the days passed, we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The atmosphere in the cabin grew increasingly tense, and we decided it was best to cut our trip short and return home. We packed our belongings and left the cabin behind, its isolated location offering little comfort. To this day, I can't be sure if what we encountered that night was truly a skinwalker, but the fear it instilled in us will never be forgotten. The legends of the Navajo Nation are steeped in mystery and darkness, and I can only hope that we never again cross paths with the supernatural entities that roam those remote woods.